Grace and peace to you from God our Father and our Lord Jesus Christ. As Blake said, the text for this morning's sermon comes from the gospel reading heard just a few moments ago. So, dear Christian friends, I am sure at some point you've heard the phrase, just trust me. It's used pretty often in TV and in movies, but often when it's used there, it comes right before a scene shift where after a character says that, you see everything went horribly wrong. It's a time when you probably shouldn't have trusted that person. But often in our own lives, we tend to say these words to somebody who's anxious and worried about something that's coming. Or you will hear it from somebody when you're worried about how something will go. But the way we respond to this phrase, just trust me, heavily depends on who it is that's saying it. So to wrap our minds around this, I want you to imagine a scenario with me. It's late at night. You just got comfortable in bed. You're just about to fall asleep. The lights just turned off, and as you're fading into the night, a bat flies into your bedroom. Now, I know, some of us in this room can relate to this a little bit better, but just stick with me for a minute. This unexpected and surprising guest comes in and causes you to panic like you've never panicked before. And so, down on the ground, you army crawl out of this room, sealing every door between you and it, leaving it to be there by itself, unsure of what's coming in the morning. But the sun rises, and you've sent out the call for help, and so that morning you get two very different knocks on your door. The first is early in the morning. One of the neighborhood teenage boys is standing there behind the door with a golf club. He heard about the bat, and he may have heard your screams, so he came and decided to help. This boy, though, is by himself. He has no experience dealing with bats, and he's not really sure what he's going to do. But he wants to help. And seeing the very worried look on your face as you stand in the door frame, he says, "Just trust me. I'll handle this." How comforting is that? Later, a second knock is heard at the door. When you open it, this time it's a bunch of your congregation members, and with them came an exterminator. With them, they all have experience dealing with bats, whether it's in their own home or somewhere else. And so they lay out before you the plan, where they're going to go in the house, what they're going to do to get rid of it and make sure that it's gone. And the exterminator, who has the most experience, who has the tools and the ability, seeing the look on your face, turns to you and says, "Just trust me. I'll handle this." How comforting that is. Trust is a tricky thing. Like I said before, it's caught up in two different things. First, how big is the promise that the person is making to you? And second, who is making the promise? In this scenario, we're unlikely to trust the teenage boy, not because he's a teenager, but because he doesn't have the experience. He's all alone, and he doesn't know what to do. But with the congregation members and the exterminator, we're much more likely to trust because they do have the experience, the abilities, and the tools to make it happen. And so when they make that promise to you that they will handle it, you can trust them. And trust is really what's at the heart of our reading this morning. Jesus doesn't outright say it, but to the crowds and the disciples, he's asking the question, who is it that you trust? But to better understand this reading, we need to go to last week's reading. So last week we heard the parable of the rich fool. He had so many crops that his barns were completely full, so he decided to tear them down to the ground and rebuild larger ones in their place. His overabundance of goods would be stored up for his own personal use so he could have a nice, easy, long life. But little did he know, God would take his life the next day, leaving those barns full of goods to someone else. This man, this barn builder, this rich fool, who did he trust? Himself. He thought that he knew what was coming. He thought he had control over his future and knew what he wanted, and so he did what he thought he could. You can almost imagine him every morning walking past the mirror, looking at himself, saying, "Oh, just trust me, I've got this, I'll take care of everything." But it doesn't work out that way. And so Jesus tells this parable to warn the crowds that the overabundance of good isn't all there is to life. This man was not in control of his future, and he placed his whole trust in the wrong place. And so now, after talking to the crowds, we get to our reading this morning, and we see Jesus turning and talking to his disciples. He says to them, "Do not be anxious about what you will eat or what you will wear. Life is about more than all that." Even the disciples of Jesus are worried about these things. Why else would he have to say this to them? Some of them have been with him and seen him cast out demons and feed 5,000 people with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. But even they are worried about where their next meal will come from and what clothes they will wear. And so their anxiety rises. Their trust moves at times back into themselves, and their worry continues to grow. And so Jesus tells them to stop worrying, because life is about more than all these things. But when Jesus tells them to not be anxious, he does not just leave them with that. He shares why they need not worry. And so he points first to the ravens. In contrast to the barn builders, the ravens have no storehouses. They have no barns. But they go around life not worrying about what they'll eat and where the food will come from, because they know that God will provide for them. And then Jesus goes to the lilies. The lilies cover the grass. They make the fields beautiful. And the lilies do none of this on their own. They do not plant themselves. They do not water themselves. God is the one who does all these things for them. And God does all of this and continues to provide for the lilies even when he knows the grass will be cut and they'll be thrown in the oven the next day. And so Jesus speaks to the crowds about the ravens and the lilies to show God's care for his creation. And then says to them, "How much more valuable are you than these things?" And if God does all of these things, if he cares for the ravens and the lilies so much and then values you more, why do you have any need to worry? God will do even more for you, disciples, than he does for them. And so with these words, with these promises, Jesus says to his disciples, just trust me. I'll handle this. How easy is it for us to be like the crowds and like the disciples? Our trust is often misplaced, put into something else closer to us. In the small catechism, to follow the first commandment, "You shall have no other God," means to fear, love, and trust in God above all else. The reformer Martin Luther said that a God is the thing in which we put our trust in for all good. And so what's that for you? What things do you place your trust in because it seems easier to do than trust that God will provide? In case you're struggling a bit, I've got 2 I'd like to share. The first is the common one throughout all human history: money. Pastor Dan last week brought this up and talked about it some. And quite often we get this thought of, if I just have enough money, I will never have to worry about anything ever again. And so this line of thinking leads some of us to working ourselves to exhaustion to get a little bit more on a paycheck, even when we already have enough. Now, especially, this thinking also leads for us to look for different things to do for extra cash, side hustles like 20-year-olds tend to call it. Things like that just seeking to get more money, even when they already have enough. And what happens is the things that God already provides is gone by, it's unseen, and the roles he gives to us is ignored in this pursuit for something else that we trust in. The second that tends to be common is ourselves. We can become gods when we put trust in ourselves that way. Idols, gods, that's all that we become when we think we have control. We think we know exactly what we need to do, and if I just follow this plan, everything will work out right. You've probably heard others who say, well, I'm going to go to this college and do this major and get this job with this income, and life is going to be fine. But what about when something goes wrong? What about when unforeseen circumstances change that? What about when you fail and the plan goes out of control? What happens? Worry and anxiety start to creep in. As problems grow more and more, the control slips out of your hand and despair comes in and grasps it with a firm grip. And you become engulfed in fear of the future. When we say, I'll just trust myself on this, we turn away from the one who can be trusted, the only one who can save. And so these words from Jesus are for us too. Do not be anxious. Not because anxiety is a sin, but because God does and wants to provide for you out of his love. A God who says to you, just trust me. I'll handle this. And in case you're unsure, and in case you doubt that God will provide for you, look at creation. Consider the ravens. In the last 2,000 years, has God stopped providing for them? What about the lilies? Both of these are alive and well, and you are still more valuable to God than they are. You are so valuable to him, in fact, that Jesus came not just to teach and not just to provide for people at that time, but to go to a cross for you. And through that cross, he brings a treasure which never fails, which is greater than anything we can find or earn here on earth. Through his blood, he washes us clean of his sins, giving us a treasure that can never be stolen or eaten by moths. And in the waters of baptism, this same Jesus comes to you with a nail-pierced hand, saying, just trust me. I'll handle this. Who better to trust than the King of Kings, the one whose word never fails? And so do not be anxious, for Christ has handled it all. And so as we come to a close, I'd like to leave you with this story to help show one way that life looks when you reflect on these words from Christ. A young man is in school, reaching the end of his second year. On his plate is a massive pile of stress from schoolwork, job responsibilities, and all of his other roles as a son, a sibling, and a spouse. His worry about everything has grown to such a point that he doesn't know what he's going to do. He's losing his mind, and he feels like he's lost control. And so in an attempt to clear his mind, he decides, I'm going to go walk around campus, and while I walk, I'll make a plan, and I'll figure this all out myself. But as he walks, nothing changes. The worry keeps growing, and he becomes so frustrated he can't help but scream to the sky and scream to God, what do I need to do? And so he keeps walking. But something catches his attention in the field. He stopped and he watches as these small blurs of fur fly around, darting in between the trees, chasing one another, and he counts that there's 4, 5, 6 rabbits just running in the field, playing with no care in the world. And as he stood there, he couldn't help but have the reading from this morning creep back up in the back of his mind. Do not be anxious. Consider the ravens, the lilies, the rabbits. At that moment, he became more content, and he left with a renewed strength to do the things that he must. Did all of his problems go away? No. And yes, there's some anxiety, some worry that always stays. But he knew that he could trust in the one who's actually in control, rather than trying to trust himself. And so, as we leave here today, consider the rabbits and how God provides for them and how you are of more value to Him than they are. Amen.